Michael Carter always avoided mirrors. To anyone who knew him, he was just a lonely archivist who spent his days among dusty bookshelves in an old library in central London. But his aversion to mirrors wasn't just a quirk. It was fear, a fear that had haunted him since childhood. It all started in 1946 when he was 12 years old. One night in the bathroom of his home, while brushing his teeth, he noticed something strange. His reflection seemed delayed, lagging behind his movements. A subtle but noticeable delay. He blinked. His reflection blinked afterward. He moved his head. The reflection hesitated before following. At first he thought it was his imagination, but it kept happening, and sometimes he swore he saw a strange gleam in the reflection's eyes, as if something was watching him. The fear grew silently. At 17 in 1951, he had the worst experience yet. One night, as he washed his face in the bathroom, he looked into the mirror and blinked. His reflection didn't blink. It just stared back at him. Then slowly it blinked on its own, out of sync. A chill ran down Michael's spine. His stomach turned when, for a fraction of a second, the reflection smirked. From that day on, he avoided mirrors at all costs. He shaved without looking, averted his eyes in public restrooms, and covered the mirror in his bedroom with an old cloth. When he graduated with a history degree and got a job at the library in 1957, he thought he had escaped. The old, dimly lit atmosphere gave him peace of mind, no mirrors to face. But the fear never truly left him. October 1964, Michael was 30 years old and lived alone in a small apartment. That night, he stayed late at the library, organizing 18th century manuscripts. The clock struck 12:15 when he left. He walked through the empty, fog-covered streets and entered his home, exhausted. In the bathroom, he reached for his toothbrush. It was automatic. He hadn't meant to look at the mirror, but he did. And then he saw it. His reflection didn't move with him. Michael blinked. His reflection remained still for a moment. Then it smiled, slow, wide, a grin that didn't belong to him. A chill crawled down his spine. The toothbrush slipped from his hand. His first instinct was to blink repeatedly, hoping it was just a trick of the dim light. But the reflection held that eerie grin for a second longer before returning to normal. He ran to his bedroom and locked the door. But after that night, everything changed. Books he left on the table appeared rearranged. Closet doors he always shut were slightly open in the morning. A dirty mug sat in the sink, one he didn't remember using. He felt watched at all times. Then November came. One freezing night, Michael woke up to an overwhelming sense of suffocation. The air in his room felt heavy, thick. He opened his eyes and saw a shadow beside his bed. His heart stopped. The faint glow of the street lamp cast light on a familiar face. His own, but the eyes were hollow, deep black voids. The skin was too pale, and the smile, that twisted, cruel smile he had seen in the mirror. He tried to move, but his body was paralyzed. The figure leaned closer, and a hoarse whisper filled the silence. "I've waited too long. Now it's my turn." It was his own voice, but distorted as if it echoed from some distant place. Before he could react, everything went dark. When he woke up, he was alone. The clock read 3:47. Trembling, he rushed to the bathroom. He looked into the mirror. His reflection smiled before he did. He blinked. His reflection didn't. Panicked, he tried to leave the apartment. The door wouldn't budge. He pulled harder, nothing. Then he heard it. A low chuckle coming from the bathroom. He turned. The mirror was empty. The next morning, Michael didn't show up at the library. His supervisor, Mr. Grayson, found it strange. Michael was never late. 2 days passed with no word, so he called the police. When officers forced the apartment door open, everything was in place. The bed was neatly made, books perfectly aligned, the kitchen spotless. No signs of struggle or break-in, but in the bathroom, they found something disturbing. The mirror was covered in handprints, dozens of them, as if someone had tried to push through the glass. All the fingerprints belonged to Michael. He was never seen again. The case was filed as an unsolved disappearance. Months later, the apartment was rented out to new tenants, but they soon reported strange occurrences: footsteps at night, doors opening on their own, the unsettling feeling of being watched. Some swore they saw a man standing in front of the mirror, a man who vanished the moment they looked directly at him. At the library, staff began noticing something even more chilling. On quiet nights, a shadow appeared reflected in the glass of the bookshelves. A thin man with dark hair, identical to Michael Carter. But when they turned around, there was never anyone there. Winter in Vancouver was relentless that year. Snow covered the streets in a thick blanket, and the biting wind made everyone huddle inside their heavy coats. It was on one of those freezing nights that Matthew Foster, a 26-year-old young man, realized something was wrong with his new apartment. He had moved in just 3 weeks earlier to an old building in the city center. The rent was surprisingly low considering the location, and the apartment, though small, had a certain charm with its exposed brick walls and large windows overlooking a quiet alley. But from the very first night, Matthew felt a strange presence in the place. At first, it was just subtle noises, a creak on the wooden floor, a distant whisper he attributed to the wind. But as days passed, the occurrences became impossible to ignore. Objects moved during the night. The kitchen faucet turned on by itself, and then came the whispers. One night, Matthew woke up startled by a strange sound. He looked around the room, dimly lit by the weak glow of the street lamp outside. The sound seemed to be coming from the hallway, a low, indecipherable murmur. Holding his breath, he got up and slowly walked to the door. Peeking into the dark hallway, his eyes widened. There was a shadow at the end of the corridor, a human silhouette standing there, motionless. Matthew's heart pounded. He blinked and the figure was gone. The next morning, he tried to convince himself it had just been a dream. But when he entered the bathroom, he found something that sent a chill through his blood. On the fogged-up mirror, a message had been written by invisible fingers. "Don't look at her." From that night on, everything got worse. He started hearing footsteps in the apartment when he was alone. Doors slammed shut, and then came the night he saw her. It was late, almost 3 in the morning. Matthew was sitting on the couch, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched, when he noticed a strange reflection in the window. His heart nearly stopped when he realized it wasn't his reflection. A pale woman with long, disheveled hair was standing behind him right at the kitchen entrance. Her sunken, empty eyes stared at him, unblinking. Matthew spun around in a panic, but there was no one there. Only the dark, empty kitchen. He didn't sleep that night, or the next. Afraid to close his eyes, he spent the entire night awake, the lights on. But on the third night, exhaustion won. He woke up with the eerie feeling that someone was very close. Too close. Slowly, he opened his eyes and found her face inches from his. The woman was leaning over him, her eyes black as endless voids. And then she whispered, "You looked." Matthew's scream echoed through the apartment. In a frenzy, he jumped out of bed, stumbled, and ran to the door. But as he yanked the doorknob, he realized it was locked from the inside. Panting, he turned back and saw her again. Now she stood motionless in the middle of the room. The grotesque smile that stretched across her face sent a deep chill down Matthew's spine. The next morning, the neighbors called the police after hearing screams during the night. When the officers broke down the apartment door, they found the place completely empty. No sign of Matthew. The only clue about his whereabouts was on the bathroom mirror. This time the message was different. "She took me." Michael Turner was a practical man. A civil engineer, 42 years old, widowed for 2 years. He lived alone in a simple house on the outskirts of Vancouver, a modest 1950s construction, surrounded by tall trees that became ominous at nightfall. After his wife's death, he buried himself in work and avoided social contact. His only company was the radio, which he kept on at all times to drive away the silence. At the end of September, Michael received an unexpected call from a lawyer. His great-uncle, Henry Whitmore, had passed away at 96, leaving him a property on the outskirts of the city. It was a Victorian mansion, abandoned for decades. Michael almost refused the inheritance. He barely knew the deceased relative, but curiosity won. After all, he was an engineer. Restoring an old mansion could be an interesting project. On the first day of October, he drove to the property. The house was immense, 3 stories tall, with high windows and broken stained glass. The garden was overgrown, and the rusted iron fence barely stood upright. The door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing a dark, dusty interior. The furniture was covered with sheets yellowed by time. Michael explored the rooms one by one. The ground floor had a grand living room, a library, and a kitchen that still held a faint scent of old wood. On the second floor, the bedrooms contained antique beds and mahogany wardrobes. But on the third floor, he found something strange. A locked room. He tried the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. In the hallway, he found a set of old keys and began testing them. On the 4th attempt, the lock clicked open with a dry snap. Inside, the air was colder. The room was small, windowless, lit only by a rusted chandelier. There was an iron bed with a moldy mattress, a desk cluttered with papers, and a mirror. The mirror was enormous, with a golden frame leaning against the opposite wall. Michael approached and noticed something odd. The glass didn't reflect properly. The image was slightly darker than the real environment, and there was a slight delay in movement. He raised his hand and his reflection followed, but for a second longer than it should have. A chill ran down his spine. Something in that room unsettled him, so he left, locking the door behind him. In the following weeks, Michael tried to ignore the unease. He spent his afternoons cleaning the house and taking notes on the necessary renovations. But at night, the silence grew heavier. The wind whistled through the cracks, making the wood creak like light footsteps. Sometimes he swore he heard distant whispers, but he told himself it was just the wind. Then the dreams started, always the same. He was on the 3rd floor, standing before the mirror. But in the reflection, the room was different. The walls were clean, the furniture well kept, and someone was standing behind him, a pale woman with sunken eyes watching him. In the dream, he tried to turn and see her, but his body wouldn't respond. The reflection smiled, and then everything went dark. One day, waking up drenched in sweat after one of those nightmares, he decided to investigate. He grabbed a crowbar and went up to the 3rd floor. The room was the same as before, except for the mirror. Now, the golden frame seemed brighter. He approached and touched the glass. The reflection seemed to ripple as if it were water. Michael stepped back, his heart pounding. Something inside him screamed at him to leave. But as he turned toward the door, he heard a whisper. "Stay." He froze. The sound didn't come from behind him. It came from the mirror. Slowly, he turned back. The reflection now showed the woman from his dream standing behind him. But when he turned around in real life, there was no one there. Without thinking twice, he ran out, locked the house, and drove back to Vancouver. He tried to convince himself it had all been his imagination. But that night, in his apartment, he woke up to a familiar sound. A creak. His body went cold. His apartment had no creaking doors. He slowly got up, turned on the light, and looked around. Everything seemed normal. But as he passed by the hallway, his heart nearly stopped. The bathroom mirror was fogged as if someone had breathed on it. And there, in the center of the glass, a message had been written with invisible fingers. You already belong to this house.